The year 927, and a new kingdom is rising from the ashes of fractured lands. King Athelstan has just swept through the north, claiming York from the last Viking holdouts, and suddenly the patchwork of Anglo-Saxon realms snaps together into one unified England. No more separate kingdoms squabbling. Now there's a single ruler over a land stretching from Wessex in the south to Northumbria in the north. It's a raw, exhilarating moment, the birth of England as we know it. But while swords and oaths made the headlines, the real story of survival played out in the fields, hearths and storehouses of ordinary folk. These early English people weren't living in some misty legend. They were farmers, fishers and foragers, turning the soil and seasons into the fuel that held this newborn kingdom together. Their meals weren't grand banquets every night. They were clever, gritty, seasonal triumphs that kept bellies full through raids, bad harvests, and the hard work of building a nation from scratch. Right from the start, the land itself dictated the rules. By the 10th century, open field farming had taken root across the shires, with villages pooling their efforts on vast strips of arable ground worked by heavy-wheeled ploughs pulled by teams of oxen. These ploughs bit deep into the clay soils far more effectively than older tools, turning former wilds and abandoned plots into productive heartlands. Families and neighbors rotated crops in a three-field system, some planted, some left fallow to recover, some grazed by livestock to naturally fertilize the earth. Barley led the charge because it thrived in England's damp, unpredictable weather, followed by hardy rye and oats that could handle poorer ground. Wheat grew more reliably now on the richer soils, but it was still a step up for many. This organized push for grain wasn't just about filling plates. It created surpluses that fed growing villages, supported Athelstan's growing court, and even funded the first hints of trade networks stitching the kingdom together. Every day revolved around those grains. Barley got crushed on hand querns into coarse flour, then baked into dense flatbreads on hot stones or in simple clay ovens built just outside the timber homes. Rye and oats mixed in for loaves that lasted longer in storage, while a bit of wheat made for finer texture when times allowed. Bread wasn't a side dish, it was the foundation, often doubling as a plate to soak up juices or hold portions of whatever else was on offer. And that whatever else almost always meant pottage, the one-pot miracle simmering away over the central hearth fire in every household. Leeks gave it a sharp backbone. Onions and garlic added punch without needing fancy imports. Cabbages swelled fat in garden plots, and turnips or parsnips came straight from the earth, earthy and filling. Peas and beans climbed trellises or fences, not only feeding people, but quietly fixing nitrogen back into the soil for the next planting. Foraged mushrooms from nearby woods brought a meaty chew on good days, and wild herbs like sorrel or nettle edged the flavor without any exotic spices. A splash of milk from the cow, or a handful of grains to thicken it, turned the pot into something hearty enough to power a full day's labor in the fields or workshops. This wasn't fancy cooking, it was smart, efficient eating that stretched every resource. Meat and fish played supporting roles, carefully managed so nothing went to waste. Livestock earned their keep first through work or byproducts. Cows for milk turned into cheese and butter that could be salted and stored, sheep for wool clipped each spring, goats for hardy dairy in tougher spots. Fast breeders that happily rooted in woodlands for acorns and scraps, ready to be butchered when needed rather than hoarded. A side of pork roasted over the fire or stirred into pottage brought richness, but for most families it appeared only a handful of times a year. Usually when an old animal grew too lame to pull its weight, or during the big autumn cull. Coastal communities, or those along rivers, had an advantage with fish, eels wriggling out of woven traps, salmon speared on their upstream runs, perch and pike hauled in nets, or cockles and oysters raked from the shores at low tide. Inland folk bartered for smoked or salted catches that travelled well without spoiling. Wild game like deer or boar from the forests, or hares snared in the fields, added excitement when hunters got lucky, but it was never guaranteed. Hunting was a bonus, not a daily plan. The seasons ran the show like a strict timetable no one could ignore. Spring brought the first flush of tender greens and young lambs or kids, their milk a welcome lift after winter's dried stores. Summer meant plunging hands into hedgerows for berries, plums, cherries, and early apples, eaten fresh or stewed with honey from the beehives buzzing at the edge of every settlement. Autumn exploded with activity. Grains cut and stacked in barns, nuts cracked from the forest floor, fattened on fallen fruit before the slaughter. That's when the big cull happened. Extra animals thinned to save winter feed, their meat packed in salt crystals mined from local seams, or smoked slow in sheds until it hardened for months of use. Preservation was survival's secret weapon. No ice or fancy containers meant drying fruits on racks near the fire, burying root vegetables in straw-lined pits, or fermenting barley into ale that stayed safe and drinkable far longer than water from shared streams. Weak ale flowed daily for everyone, even children. It quenched thirst without the risks and added extra calories. Stronger brews or sweet mead waited for feasts after a solid harvest, when the whole village might gather to celebrate. Life around the hearth wove meals into the social glue of the new kingdom. Families and neighbours shared bowls of pottage and hunks of bread with simple knives and spoons, swapping tales of the latest royal decree from Athelstan or a traveller's news from up the old Roman roads. A farmer might trade a wheel of cheese with the next holding after mending a shared fence or threshing grain together. Even the emerging thegns and local lords ate much the same most days, saving extras like beef from bigger herds or fresh river hauls for gatherings that strengthened bonds across the shires. Trade helped smooth the edges, salt hauled from coastal works for curing, the occasional peppercorn or spice for those who could afford it through growing markets, but the bulk came straight from the land. This mix of farming, herding, and wild resources built real resilience. A wet summer ruined the wheat, barley and oats still delivered. Rivers flooded the fields, fish traps kept protein coming. Late winter hunger loomed, foraged nettles, stored roots and smoked meats bridged the gap until spring. As the 10th century rolled on and England settled into its new shape under Athelstan's successors, this food system quietly powered everything. Farms fed expanding settlements, stored surpluses saw communities through threats from across the sea, and the seasonal rhythm taught adaptability that let the kingdom grow stronger. Crop rotation kept soils alive, animals grazing stubble naturally renewed the fields, and knowledge passed down through generations turned trial and error into tradition. One bad year didn't break everyone, because the balance of grains, dairy, fish, and foraged backups spread the risk. Surplus cheese or smoked ham traded for iron tools or better plows strengthened farms even more, weaving connections between coast and inland, north and south. Think about the hands that turned those barley fields into loaves, the fires that smoked pork through long nights, the shared pots that fueled plough teams and fence menders alike. No global ships, no corner shops, just pure ingenuity matching the land's moods with human effort. These early English folk didn't just claim a kingdom with battles, they fed it into existence. One preserved ham, one bowl of pottage, one crusty loaf at a time. Their simple yet clever ways laid the groundwork for the shires, laws, and identity that would define England for centuries. Next time you tear into a piece of bread or stir a vegetable stew, picture those 10 Thechelly hearths crackling under English skies. That quiet endurance, bite by resilient bite, is how a newborn kingdom didn't just survive, it thrived and set the stage for everything that followed. And so, from those humble hearths and hard-won fields, England found its first true strength, not in grand halls or royal oaths, but in the daily rhythm of bread, pottage, and preserved bounty. These early folk turned scarcity into survival, season by season, bite by resilient bite. Next time you break a simple loaf or taste a hearty stew, remember the quiet fire that forged a kingdom. That was the real birth of England, ordinary hands feeding an extraordinary future.